The morning of December 22nd, 1945, arrived with a silence that felt heavy, draped over the skeletal remains of Frankfurt like a shroud. Inside the IG Farben building, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood under the harsh, solitary glow of a desk lamp, his shadow stretching long against the cold stone walls. The telephone had rung at 6:47 a.m., delivering a message he had expected but was nonetheless unprepared to absorb. General George S. Patton Jr. was dead. The man who had survived the lead-filled skies of the Meuse-Argonne and the scorched sands of North Africa had been brought down by a blood clot in a bed in Mannheim. Eisenhower looked at the framed portrait on his desk, meeting the iron gaze of his oldest friend and most difficult subordinate. The world would soon weep for a fallen hero, but Eisenhower knew the world only saw the mask. To preserve the truth, he reached for a pen. He began to write of 1919 and Camp Meade, where two young officers once tore apart a tank to understand its soul, forging a bond in grease and steel that would eventually break the Third Reich. Eisenhower's pen paused over the paper, the ink pooling slightly as he navigated the most guarded secret of the Mediterranean campaign. In August 1943, following the infamous slapping incidents in Sicily, the world believed Patton was being punished for his volatility. The press screamed for his removal, and Washington demanded he be sent home in disgrace. Eisenhower had publicly promised an impartial assessment, but in the quiet of his Frankfurt office, he confessed it was all a calculated lie. He never intended to let George go. He knew Patton's aggressive fire was the only guarantor of Allied victory. Instead, he transformed his friend into a ghost. For 11 agonizing months, Eisenhower kept Patton in a state of enforced inactivity, using him as the centerpiece of Operation Fortitude to bait the German high command. While Patton sent dozens of letters begging for command, bleeding from the psychological wound of being sidelined, Eisenhower watched in silence. He sacrificed Patton's pride and happiness on the altar of strategic necessity, keeping him in limbo to ensure that when the real invasion began, the Germans would be looking the wrong way. The winter of 1944 brought a crisis that threatened to undo everything they had built. As Eisenhower continued to write, he recalled the emergency meeting at Verdun on December 19th. The German offensive in the Ardennes had shattered American lines, leaving the 101st Airborne surrounded at Bastogne and Allied morale in free fall. Eisenhower had needed a miracle, a commander who could do the militarily impossible by pivoting a massive force 90 degrees in the middle of a blizzard. Before the room could even settle, Patton had made his legendary claim. He would attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. To the other generals, it sounded like madness, but Eisenhower knew better. While others were paralyzed by the shock of the breakthrough, Patton had already prepared for it. Yet, even as George achieved the impossible and broke through to Bastogne on December 26th, Eisenhower revealed a secret ranking he had kept buried. Privately, he placed Patton third behind Bradley and Smith in overall utility. He recognized Patton was the most brilliant commander of an army in open warfare the world had ever seen, yet he remained a weapon too sharp to handle without constant, cautious oversight. The ink on the page seemed to darken as Eisenhower moved to April 1945, a memory that stripped away the remaining romanticism of war. He recalled the visit to the Order concentration camp alongside Patton and Bradley, where the smell of death was a physical weight. They found piles of emaciated corpses and evidence of systematic murder that defied any rational military description. While Eisenhower forced himself to document every horror to ensure the world could never deny it, he witnessed a side of George the public never saw. The man who had led bayonet charges and laughed at artillery fire finally broke. Patton stepped behind a barracks and vomited, his characteristic bravado replaced by a hollow, silent despair. That evening, as they shared a drink in a quiet room, Patton's voice lacked its usual theatrics when he whispered, "Now we know why we were fighting." Eisenhower recorded this vulnerability as his fourth secret, honoring the moment the warrior's heart finally shattered under the realization that their enemy wasn't just a military force, but a manifestation of pure evil. The final secret was the most difficult to ink, recording the cold death of a 26-year friendship in September 1945. Eisenhower recalled summoning Patton to his Frankfurt office to address the general's politically reckless comparisons between the Nazi Party and American political factions. Washington was screaming for blood, and Eisenhower, ever the diplomat, knew he had to act. He effectively stripped Patton of operational command, relegating him to a paper organization, a move that saw the legendary fire in George's eyes finally flicker out. But as the pen moved, Eisenhower confessed the deeper betrayal. He actually agreed with Patton's warnings about the Soviet Union becoming the next great threat to Western security. He recognized that Patton's compulsive honesty was his greatest strength as a warrior and his fatal flaw as a statesman. To preserve the fragile Allied unity, Eisenhower had sacrificed his friend, publicly condemning the very views he secretly held. When Patton walked out that day, the bond forged at Camp Meade was severed by the sharp edge of political necessity, leaving Eisenhower with a victory that tasted of ashes and a silence that would never be filled. The decades that followed the war were a whirlwind of unprecedented responsibility and public acclaim, yet a heavy silence lingered in the shadows of Eisenhower's soul. As he rose from Chief of Staff to the presidency of the United States, the world saw a man of immense power, the architect of the interstate highway system and the guardian of the Cold War. But behind the closed doors of the Oval Office, there was a locked drawer that held the 5 secrets he had written on that cold morning in Frankfurt. For 24 years, he carried the burden of the truth he had finally been able to express in private, even as he shaped a post-war world that George could never have imagined. He had managed crises in Korea and Vietnam, always utilizing the strategic planning that was his hallmark, yet he often found himself staring at the space where Patton's fire should have been. The fame and influence he achieved felt incomplete, haunted by the memory of the friend he had lost and the professional partnership that had once been the most successful in military history. He was the supreme commander, but he remained the sole keeper of a fractured legacy that time could not heal. By March 1969, the man who had commanded millions and shaped the destiny of nations lay in a quiet room at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, his body finally failing him. At 78, Eisenhower's thoughts drifted away from the Cold War and the interstate highway, returning instead to a cold morning in Frankfurt and the locked drawer that held his true assessment of the war. In his final conversations, he spoke with a haunting intensity about the man he called Georgie, acknowledging the bitter and inescapable irony that they were opposites who could not survive without one another. He was fire, I was ice, Eisenhower whispered, his voice weak but clear. He admitted that while he had been the better strategist and diplomat, Patton had been the better combat commander, the best of us in the chaos of the battlefield. As the end approached, the Supreme Commander finally let go of the political masks he had worn for decades. His final realization was a testament to a broken friendship. The war had required both the planner and the warrior, and together, they had been truly unstoppable. The final assessment that Eisenhower locked away for decades was not merely a professional evaluation, but a confession of his own limitations. He recognized that while he had been the better strategist and the more adept manager of coalition warfare, George Patton possessed a singular, primal brilliance that the war had fundamentally required. Eisenhower understood that his own ice, his planning and diplomacy, would have eventually won the war, but it would have taken longer and cost thousands more American lives without Patton's fire. Patton was the better tactical opportunist, the leader who could master the chaos of a fluid battlefield in ways Eisenhower never could. In the end, Eisenhower's private memoir concluded that they were never truly rivals, but two halves of a single, unstoppable command team. This was the secret he had guarded. The Supreme Commander's greatest success was not just his own planning, but his willingness to unleash and protect a man as difficult and indispensable as George Patton. With the weight of 26 years finally recorded, Eisenhower could at last offer the salute he hadn't given in life. Rest in peace, old friend. You were the best of us. The legacy of the Five Secrets was never meant for the history books of the 1940s, but for the conscience of the man who led the free world. Eisenhower understood that his silence was the final price of his rank. By keeping Patton's vulnerabilities, their shared fears of the Soviet shadow, and the true nature of the D-Day deception buried, he had protected the stability of the post-war era. Yet, as the final pages of his private memoir were concluded, the weight of the Supreme Commander title seemed lighter. He had finally reconciled the ice of his duty with the fire of his friendship. The image of the two men in 1919, covered in tank grease and dreaming of a future they would eventually define, remained the most vivid memory of all. Eisenhower's confession changed everything because it proved that the most powerful man in the world was not a cold machine of war, but a friend who had been forced to break his own heart to save the world. The secrets were the testament to a bond that proved, even in the calculated world of high command, the human spirit, in all its messy, aggressive, and devoted glory, was the ultimate architect of victory. History remembers the victories, but it rarely reveals the personal cost paid by those who led. If you found this journey into the hidden heart of the Supreme Command gripping, then you won't want to miss our next deep dive into the shadows of history. Tap the like button and subscribe to join us as we uncover more truths that remained buried for decades. What do you think? Was Eisenhower right to sacrifice his friendship for the war, or was the cost too high? Let us know in the comments below. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we reveal the secret correspondence that changed the course of the Cold War. Until then, keep questioning the history you think you know.